Hello, everyone. Thank you for clicking on the third in a series of recorded lectures about the situation in Palestine and Israel. This will be the final lecture for the time being, and it will cover the events starting on October 7th, 2023, to the present. I want to say just one brief word, and that is to give a warning about this material. It will be more so than the first two, potentially distressing. The material may be triggering, so bear that in mind. For the most part, I have chosen not to show people suffering. There is one photo of a young boy who was starving to death because of the Israeli imposed starvation in Gaza, and I've chosen to show him, as you'll see, for a very specific reason. And he is now, as of a few days ago at least, doing much better. I hope that remains the case. Other photos, other words you hear may be distressing, so do please bear that in mind. So, we covered in the last two series of lectures all of the history that brought us to October 7th. The over a century of Zionist colonization of Ottoman and then British Palestine, leading to the creation of the State of Israel, the ethnic cleansing of most of the Palestinian population who were, to repeat, the overwhelming majority of the population of the territory at the moment in the period when the Zionists, a European nationalist movement, decided to take the territory for themselves. So we went through all of that history before. It led us to the reality, the ongoing situation of military occupation of both the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, the terrible conditions that have been created for the people of Gaza, hunger and poverty, and many other issues, and the regular and repeated Israeli attacks against Gaza in order to maintain its military occupation, its dominance, and to expand its territorial control in this part of the world. And so that leads us to October 7th. October 7th was a series of attacks led by Hamas, but also involving fighters from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, where fighters from these groups broke through the Israeli-imposed border fence around Gaza, and they broke in and they entered into Israel proper. And in a series of planned attacks against military targets and other kind of elements of the Israeli state, there were also spontaneous attacks as well. And there was targeting, it appears, of both military targets, soldiers, and so forth, but also of civilians. And in those attacks, the latest figure we have is that 1,139 people were killed, the majority of them Israeli, though there were some people who were killed who were foreign civilians, who were guest workers or immigrants of various kinds in Israel. And the majority of people killed on October 7th were civilians, almost 700 people, including 36 children. The rest were security forces, military, police, and the like. And importantly, a part of this attack was the taking of hostages. So around 250 people were taken hostage and brought into Gaza. Now, this attack, as you saw, if you watched the previous two lectures, is sort of unprecedented in its scale, in the violence and the number of casualties that, if you recall from the previous slides, from 2008 until October 6th of 2023, 319 Israelis were killed in that 15-year period. So in this single attack, something like 4 times as many people almost were killed in a single day. Now, what then has been the Israeli response to this attack? Massive indiscriminate bombing of Gaza at a scale completely unprecedented. It far surpasses even the catastrophic bombing in 2008, 2009, and 2014. We've seen a ground invasion of Gaza by the Israeli military. And we've also seen other tactics, such as the intentional denial of food, water, and medicine into Gaza. So the Israeli government, and this has varied over the months that this has been going on since October of last year, but the Israeli government has blocked aid from coming into Gaza, blocked the borders, prevented trucks and food and medicine and so forth from coming in, with the explicit purpose of denying these things to the population, causing collective punishment, harming the people so that they will be beaten, so that they will rise up against Hamas, and so forth. There has also been, and this is a really critical thing to understand, mass hostage taking by Israel, including the capture of Palestinians, the torture of Palestinians, and the latest figures I've seen is that we've seen several dozen people captured from Gaza, taken by Israel into prisons in Israel, and have died in those prisons since October 7th, and that this question of hostages has become really important. This idea that the Israeli government claims, and many of its supporters claim, that this is being fought, this campaign is being waged by Israel in order to get the hostages back, or that if the hostages were simply returned, this would all end. But what is left out of these discussions is that Israel has, for decades, taken Palestinians, arrested them arbitrarily, brought them to Israeli jails, held them indefinitely without trial or charges, routinely tortured them, and as I mentioned last time, including children, and this includes sexual torture, sexual violence as well in Israeli jails. And so if we are going to take seriously this question of hostages, and indeed we should, the taking of hostages, particularly civilians, is forbidden under international law. If you're taking soldiers, they're prisoners of war. But if we're talking about civilians, this is something forbidden, and not just under law, but again, as a basic moral principle, the taking of the capture of civilians should be something we don't do. But that has to be applied across the board. If Hamas is wrong to take Israeli hostages, and indeed they are, then Israel is wrong to imprison, to take hostage thousands of Palestinians, tens of thousands over the course of decades. And we have to think about both of those things simultaneously. And finally then, the Israeli response has been not a new war. What happened on October 7th was not the beginning of a war, but it was an escalation of this ongoing situation. And what Israel has done is accelerate the annihilation of Palestine and the Palestinian people that really began in 1948 with the Nakba, with the ethnic cleansing, with the killing, and so forth. And so this, as you know, is ongoing as of today, June 6th, 2024. You can see here in these pictures some sort of visual representation of what this has looked like in Gaza. The mass bombardment, the indiscriminate bombardment of Gaza, the destruction, as I'll talk about in just a moment, of hospitals and schools and electricity facilities, and thousands of homes have left in their wake an apocalypse. When this escalation began with the attack by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad on October 7th and the Israeli response to that ramping up, very quickly we have begun hearing rhetoric of genocide, that what Israel is engaged in is genocide. And indeed, without question, that's what's happening. Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians, against Palestinian society, with the explicit goal of destruction and getting rid of this population that has been a problem for Israel since its inception. The existence of this population that are occupying a territory that Israel claims for itself. I won't go into the legal aspects because I don't think they're as important as, again, the basic sort of moral and ethical intuitions of what does genocide mean. Genocide means the intentional destruction, attempt to destroy a group of people. And there are many means that this can be done, and indeed the legal definition includes many means, including creating conditions that are not amenable to life, making it so that people can't live, annihilating them, killing them, preventing births. There are a number of different criteria in the legal definition, and I think in our kind of intuition of what this would mean. What does it mean to commit genocide against a people? It means to destroy them. And part of, again, the legal definition A major part of it is intent. Is there an intent to destroy a group of people? My own view personally is that intent is less important than we often give it. We should be looking at the outcomes. We should be looking at what has actually happened, regardless of what are the stated intentions of the people doing the killing. But nevertheless, despite my own view, it is absolutely crystal clear that there is a clearly stated genocidal intent by the Israeli government, and we see these kind of discourses throughout Israeli society as well. And so I have taken just a few examples here. You can see them here on the screen. These are all quoted in the South African case submitted to the International Court of Justice, saying and hoping for a ruling that Israel is indeed committing genocide. And I've just taken here some of the examples that come from the top levels of Israeli government. So we have here Benjamin Netanyahu, who has repeatedly, since October 7th, invoked this biblical story of Amalek, which is a story about the Israelites going and killing their enemies, defeating their enemies. And you can see here what this means in the story, killing alike men and women, infants and suckling. So it is a story about genocide. It is a story about the ancient Israelites killing their enemies in a genocidal way. And Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly invoked this. One thing I want to just mention briefly about Netanyahu, he is the current Prime Minister of Israel. He is now in sort of liberal quarters given a lot of the blame for this, and sometimes it's put forward that if you could get Netanyahu out, this would stop, things would change. But indeed, the kinds of policies Israel has pursued against Palestinians have been relatively stable over time, regardless of what party has led the government, whether that was in the early days of the state, sort of a labor-led government, or now sort of a right-wing government under Netanyahu. And Netanyahu, it's important to understand, has been Prime Minister of Israel for more than 20% of the country's entire history. It is not an old country. I think I mentioned before, my own father is older than the country of Israel. But for more than 20% of its history, this single individual, Netanyahu, and his party, this right-wing party, have been in power in the country. So they are not an aberration, but they are fundamental to the actual history of the country. And Netanyahu is not the only one who has invoked Amalek. This rhetoric has become very common. We hear it from other government officials and politicians and Israeli soldiers and so forth. It also has, in addition to its genocidal intent, again, this explicit invocation that the modern state of Israel, a modern country, is directly connected to the ancient Israelites, that this is a continuity of history, this mytho-history that is being called back to. Now, several other examples. You have the defense minister saying, Gaza won't return to what it was before. We will eliminate everything. It is really quite hard to imagine for me a clearer articulation of a genocidal intent, and it requires a large amount, in my view, of cognitive dissonance and preventing oneself from understanding the common understandings and definitions of words to pretend that that's not what this statement means, or any of these statements for that matter. You have the deputy Knesset speaker, so the Knesset is the Israeli parliament, deputy speaker of the parliament saying, we all have one common goal, erasing the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth. Again, clearly genocidal, clearly eliminationist. It takes an incredible amount of mental effort to pretend or obscure that this means anything other than that. And then finally, a former member of parliament saying, they must be exterminated, all of them killed. We will flatten Gaza, turn them to dust, and the army will cleanse the area. Again, every word of this, genocidal, completely in its meaning. More examples. And there are many, many others you can find very easily. It doesn't require any special knowledge. You can find these from a simple Google search. So you have here a member of Netanyahu's party in the Knesset saying, right now, one goal, Nakba. A Nakba that will overshadow Nakba of 1948. So again, invoking the catastrophe of 1948, the mass ethnic cleansing, the mass expulsion of the majority of Palestinians, and the violence and the massacres and so forth, directly calling back to another crime against humanity. You have the Israeli heritage minister saying, anyone waving a Palestinian flag shouldn't continue to live on the face of the earth. Again, someone who's Palestinian, who claims a Palestinian identity, should be killed, eliminated from the earth. And then what is perhaps One of the most disturbing versions of this that I've yet come across is we had the head of a local council in Israel saying Israel should make Gaza look like Auschwitz. So not only directly genocidal of what not we but Israel should be doing, sending Gazans to other countries, making them refugees, flattening the Gaza Strip, but directly connecting and invoking the Holocaust against European Jewry. This is, in my view, despicable, indefensible completely. So making Gaza look like Auschwitz, directly genocidal call, something that we are seeing in Israeli culture, in media, and in the popular discourse. All of this sits within a broader context, and you can find this quite easily, of strains within an Israeli society for its entire history that are genocidal, that are eliminationist. One sees when there are state holidays, for example, marches with young Israeli men chanting death to Arabs, may your village burn, these sorts of things on the streets of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or wherever it is. So this is a major strain in Israeli society. It is a clearly articulated genocidal intent, and indeed, what the Israeli government is doing is carrying out that genocide unambiguously. Now, I want to say a few words on this slogan that has become a way to delegitimize the resistance to Israeli genocide in Gaza. Now, a chant one will hear if you've ever been to a Palestine Solidarity event or march is a chant that goes, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." It's a common chant one hears. And Israeli supporters in the United States and elsewhere have made the claim, the tendentious claim, that this is a genocidal slogan, that saying "from the river to the sea" is tantamount to calling for the genocide not only of Israelis, but all Jews everywhere in the world. Now, this takes a lot of implication. There's nothing explicit in this slogan that is genocidal. The idea is this is a crypto call. This is a hidden call for genocide that people who use this language are making. If you actually ask protesters or people who use this chant, overwhelmingly what they will tell you is that this is a call for democracy. This is a call for the liberation of Palestinians from Israeli domination and for freedom and equality for all of the people who live in this particular territory. Now that's one aspect to it. The second aspect to it is that, again, if we are going to hold people accountable for their words and for their actions, we should do so evenly. And we should understand how these rhetorics are used and mobilized as a way for propaganda for particular aims. And that it is not only Palestinians, but Palestinian solidarity activists who would use this phrase "from the river to the sea," but indeed it is a very common way that Israelis themselves talk about this territory, talk about not only their country as it is now, but what they hope their country to be, what its borders should be in the future. And so you can see here a quote from 1944 from one of the pre-state Zionist leaders saying, "From the desert to the sea, the land is one." Now, slightly different, desert instead of river, but the same basic idea. All of this territory in this case belongs to us, the Zionists in this version, and therefore we have a right to it, and we're going to take all of this territory. This is not new rhetoric, but it has existed for a very long time. In the very first set of these lectures, I showed you the symbol of one of the pre-state militias with the map in the background of it that showed not only modern-day Israel and the Palestinian territories, but also modern-day Jordan. So many pre-state Zionists and Israelis have made territorial claims on the current borders of Israel, all of the Palestinian territories, and even more broadly, large parts of Jordan, parts of modern-day Egypt, and parts of modern-day Lebanon. Again, often hearkening back to this mytho-history that there was an idea in the past that such a thing existed as a greater Israel that had these larger borders. Now, we also see, and we have many examples of this, Here you have a picture of Benjamin Netanyahu, again, long-serving prime minister of Israel, has been prime minister for 20% plus of the country's history, and he has, over the course of his tenure, appeared at the United Nations multiple times, and several times when he's done so, he's shown a map that looks like this. And now it's a little small, but what you can see here is he's showing a map. In this case, it's titled The New Middle East, and it shows in blue Israel. But you should notice something very interesting here. It does not show the occupied Palestinian territories, nor does it show Israel's current borders. But in the New Middle East, according to the long-serving Israeli prime minister, Israel will be these expanded borders that will include all of the territory from the river to the sea. So Netanyahu here is making an explicit argument, an explicit case that actually all of this territory belongs to us, and then, therefore, it does not belong to Palestinians. They have no right to claim any of this territory. And now Netanyahu, it should be remembered as well, has also openly said there will never be a Palestinian state as long as I'm prime minister. And Netanyahu and many other Israelis have gone so far as to claim Palestinians don't even actually exist at all. So if we are going to assume there is something implicit in this slogan from the river to the sea that is genocidal, there isn't in the case of Palestinians using it, certainly not for most of the Palestinians and for most of their supporters, if you actually talk to them. But for some Israelis, there very much is an eliminationist element to this idea that all of the territory from the river to the sea belongs to us. And now you can see here just an explicit example of this from a former member of the Israeli government, a former minister, saying the world should recognize Israel's historic claim to land from the river to the sea. Again, a phrase used by many people for many reasons in this situation, because roughly it describes this whole territory that we're talking about. Now, there's another element to this that I want to mention, and this is that this idea from the river to the sea is fundamentally, it's about this conflict over territory and control over territory, who gets to claim it and who has a right to it. And not only do you have high ranking at the top levels of Israeli government saying all of this territory belongs to us, and then enacting policies to carry out taking that territory for themselves, but you also see much more broadly in Israeli culture, in the kinds of ideologies and propaganda that gets spread, this idea that Israel belongs not only to its Jewish citizens, but to all Jews around the world, that it is very common to see, if you go to any Judaica store on the internet or in many parts of the world, and you go in, they will sell items that look like this. And you can see here, these are 3 examples from 3 different stores, and they all show the same map. You can see here a ring that has 1948, so the establishment of the State of Israel, and a map. You can see here the gold necklace with a map here. And then you have another necklace that has not only a map, but this has a verse from Genesis, from the Bible, in Hebrew. And I'll start there, and it says, in Hebrew, the translation is, everything you see, the whole land spread out before you, I will give to you and your children forever. So again, this is an item that is sold to Israelis, more broadly to Jews around the world, that one would wear, that has an explicit claim to all of this territory from the river to the sea. For someone who would be wearing this, it belongs to us. It belongs to Israel, it belongs to Jews, and therefore, implicitly, it does not belong to Palestinians, to Christians, to Druze, to any of the other groups of people who have lived there or currently live there. And you will notice something else very important about the maps that are articulated or that are portrayed in these items, again, that you can find at any Judaica store online or in many parts of the world. And I'll show you a comparison of that right here. So you can see here the gold necklace blown up, and you can see it's a map. It's a map of the territory from the river to the sea, but it's not just that. It is a claim to the modern borders of the State of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, and also to the Syrian Golan Heights. So if you look at this gold necklace and you see here right by where the chain is, there's a little bump of land. That's the territory that Israel took from Syria in the 1967 war that it annexed and now claims as part of its own country, its own territory. And so if we compare this map to this map in green here, and this map in green here comes from a website called Decolonize Palestine, which is a good resource if you are interested in learning more. This was put together by Palestinians themselves, by several people who I believe live in the West Bank, and I'm sure many, many others assisted with them. It has a lot of good information. And this is a map that they have depicted on their website. And what's interesting to do is to compare these two maps. So we have the gold necklace, which is an Israeli claim to territory. And then you have in green here a Palestinian claim. And what you notice is that, in fact, the Israeli claim, the map on the necklace and the ring and so forth, is actually bigger than the map from the website Decolonize Palestine because it includes, again, the Syrian Golan Heights as well. So it is an even more maximalist claim on territory than the Palestinian claim on territory from the river to the sea. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And second, interestingly, about the map from Decolonize Palestine is it's showing you what this slogan means to many people. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. You have here the territory, and visually it's represented as being chained in. And flying into or flying out of it are peace doves, maybe escaping from the territory, maybe liberating that territory. Freedom. It's currently in bondage, in the chains, and what is being sought for is freedom. So again, if we're going to think about these symbols that are being used, it's really important to think about who is using them, why, for what, and so forth. So we return then to the genocide happening right now in Gaza. And here you have sort of a rundown of what has that looked like in practice. This is from the middle of May, so these figures are out of date already, unfortunately. But we know something like 37,000 Palestinians have been killed so far, most of them civilians, a significant number of them children. The figure represented here also includes the thousands of Palestinians who are trapped under the rubble and who are likely, unfortunately, dead at this point, but we don't yet know. And so the figure is almost certainly higher. And here it's represented as 43,000. It could likely be much, much higher than that. One thing to understand is that when we see casualty figures reported for conflicts around the world, for example, often the figure is given for the Iraq War that something like 1 million people were killed. When you hear that million figure, in the case of Iraq, that's not only people who were killed by violence, so killed by guns and bombs, and in the case of Iraq, something like almost 300,000 people we know were killed by bombing and by guns and so forth. But the rest of that million figure are people who died by other means during the conflict, are victims of the war, but who died, for example, because of lack of health care, lack of food, lack of access to the basic necessities of life, the rampant spread of disease because of conflict, the pollution that conflict causes, and on and on. And so we are, unfortunately, almost certainly going to see these figures continue to rise, even if the Israeli violence ends today. But this is where we are right now. We've seen 80,000 plus people being injured, many people having amputations, losing limbs, including many, many children. Most of the people who live in Gaza have been displaced. So this is a population of people, most of whom were already refugees, and they have now been displaced over and over again by the Israeli military, forcing them to leave their homes, destroying their homes, and then forcing them to leave their refugee camps and destroying their refugee camps. We know that a majority now of homes in Gaza have been destroyed. So even when this conflict ends, people will have nowhere to go back to. Most, if not all, of the medical facilities have been damaged or destroyed. All of the universities, most of the schools, hundreds of mosques and churches have been destroyed and damaged. Almost 1,000 healthcare workers, doctors, and nurses have been killed, and on and on. The scale of the destruction and the speed of the destruction is unprecedented. we've seen a level of destruction, a saturation bombing, indiscriminate carpet bombing of Gaza, the likes of which we have not seen since World War II. These are actions taken by the Israeli government as part of its long-standing project to eliminate, to kick out the Palestinian population, to destroy any vestige of Palestinian society, and it is actively aided and abetted and supported by not only the United States, but many other countries. The United States is a direct participant in this genocide. The government under Joe Biden has been providing support to the Israeli government, continued to supply funds and weapons, likely has people on the ground supplying intelligence to the Israeli military. And in general, every year, the United States gives Israel billions of dollars for its military. We fund something like 16% of Israel's total military budget. And so it is our conflict as well, and it always has been. The United States is the largest arms supplier to Israel, followed by Germany, and then Italy, and it gets weapons from other countries and makes its own as well. So this is an ongoing genocide. It is an American genocide as much as it is an Israeli genocide. And one of the things, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, is that it is a live streamed genocide. We are witnessing, if you go on social media, you will see images, videos from this on a daily basis. It is impossible to ignore and deny the reality of what's happening. In addition to the sort of numbers, the scale of the killing and the destruction, one of these other elements that makes it different than other conflicts is the number of children who are being killed. This is not something quote unquote normal in war that happens. Thousands of children have been killed, 10,000, 12,000, maybe more at this point. We don't fully yet know. They're being killed by bombs, they're being killed by guns, and they are facing starvation. Famine is looming, and it has already killed dozens of children and people in Gaza. We are seeing children being targeted by Israeli snipers, losing limbs, being shot directly by Israeli soldiers, having amputations, and so forth. And not only is the scale of this far higher than other conflicts in the 21st century, but it's happening much more quickly. You can see here on this chart, more children have been killed in Gaza in the first couple months than it has taken over a decade to kill as many children in Syria, another absolutely horrifying, brutal conflict that's being waged. Ukraine is another conflict that is happening in the world, a horrible illegal invasion by Russia of Ukraine, and the Russian government has used tactics that are indiscriminate, that are targeting civilians, has killed far fewer children than Israel has killed in Gaza. And that is not to say that the conflict in Ukraine is not bad. It is horrifying and terrible. It is to show how much worse, how much more violence Israel is inflicting on civilians in Gaza, even compared to another already horrifying conflict. People in Gaza have lived under a blockade for decades. They've had a lack of health care, of the necessities of life. This has only increased since October 7th. Israel is intentionally denying these things to the population. And so there are many reports of children having amputations performed without anesthesia. So it is almost unimaginable to think about children being amputated without any sort of pain relief. We're seeing reports of women giving birth without any pain relief, having cesarean sections without any kind of pain relief, without any anesthesia. And we've also seen something, and this goes back, as I mentioned at the beginning, to the definition of genocide, creating the conditions where life can't go forward, preventing the births of a population. There have been reports that miscarriages have increased vastly in Gaza since October 7th. As you can imagine, the fear, the adrenaline, the uncertainty causing lots of stress to women who are pregnant, and a massive rise in miscarriages because of the Israeli violence. Just to give this kind of in another way, and these are from April, so they're slightly out of date, but again, most of the homes in Gaza have been destroyed. Most of the medical facilities have been either destroyed, targeted directly, taken as military bases by the Israeli military, put out of commission in various ways. And you can see here in April, people were getting about 250 calories a day, 12% of what they needed. People surviving on starvation diets if they can get food at all. And as I said, famine has been looming. The food needs, the desperation in Gaza only continues to increase, and this is an entirely man-made situation. Israel and Israel alone is responsible for denying food to more than 2 million people in Gaza. And they are doing this because of an intentional project to get rid of this population and because of a callous indifference to the suffering of this population because they belong to a different group. This is a fundamentally racist project of genocide. So starvation being used as a weapon of war. And I want to show you here the juxtaposition of two things. These are two different headlines from a few days apart in March. And you can see here a young boy named Fadi, age 9, experiencing severe malnutrition in Gaza because of Israel's use of food as a weapon of war. Literally starving. Shocking the conscience, these kind of pictures. Now again, simultaneously, a few days apart, you had a headline in Haaretz, one of the major Israeli newspapers, and it reads, Tel Aviv is partying in basements. Top Israeli chefs adjust to a new reality. It goes on in the subheading, a famed Michelin guide isn't coming, and neither do the tourists. How does the Israeli fine dining scene survive Hamas's October 7th massacre? As one chef puts it, fuck Michelin. The difference between these, the juxtaposition, is shocking. On the one hand, you have a population being intentionally starved by a government and a military, and on the other, you have the concerns being put forward in a major newspaper in the country doing the starvation, doing the genocide. How do we have our parties? How do we have our fine dining and deal with our restaurants that are world-renowned? The difference couldn't be any more stark. This is not a war. It is not a conflict. It is one colonial power, Israel, committing genocide against the colonized people, Palestinians in Gaza. Now, I do want to mention one small bright spot. Here we have Fadi again, who was starving to death in March. I saw this recently. He is now doing much better, as you can see. My only hope is that he continues to improve. He and all of the other children of Gaza and everyone else are able to live happy and healthy lives in the future. None of this is hidden. This is not something happening in the dark, but we're seeing this very peculiar phenomenon where Israeli soldiers themselves are publicly filming, taking photos of their crimes and putting them out on social media and sharing them with the world. And so this is partly why some have characterized this as the world's first live stream genocide. So you can see here examples here. There are hundreds, thousands of examples if you do a quick Google search. You can see here in one of the photos two soldiers who are playing with the underwear in a Palestinian home that they have destroyed and occupied. We don't know whether its occupants are still alive, but these Israeli soldiers are taking their intimate, private items and they're making jokes with them. And they are filming and photographing themselves doing this and sharing it with the world. And this is a common enough phenomenon that it has been written about in major publications all around the world. There seems to be a particular fascination with taking women's underwear from their homes, women who very likely are dead, wearing it and taking photos of themselves wearing it. We have Israeli soldiers filming themselves, shooting at random targets, blowing up mosques, blowing up homes, joking about it, laughing about it. And in one particularly grotesque video, you have an Israeli soldier who dressed up as a dinosaur and had someone film them launching mortar rounds somewhere in Gaza while dressed in this costume. Again, thousands of examples of this. Israeli soldiers, widespread, filming, creating evidence of their own crimes, laughing about the violence and the destruction that they're causing in Gaza. Again, there is an incredibly deep-seated racism in Israeli society against Palestinians, against Arabs more broadly, and against Islam. Now, amongst all of this, amongst all of the evidence we have, the clearly articulated genocidal intent by Israeli leaders, there is still widespread genocide denial, and you have several methods of this. You have, for example, fake atrocity propaganda. So the attacks on October 7th were horrifying enough. And yet, there were efforts to portray them as even worse, perhaps, than they were, to spread stories about things that happened that couldn't be verified, were later discredited. So, for example, there has been a story that went around that Hamas fighter had killed a pregnant woman and cut out their baby and then killed the baby as well. This has been debunked. There is no evidence of this, but this spread far and wide as an example of how evil Hamas is and how then, if they are evil, we are authorized to do whatever we have to do in order to stop them. And again, the attack on October 7th was already horrific enough, killed a large number of people, most of whom were civilians. We don't need fake stories in order to portray it as worse than it was. Now, another element to this is disputing the casualty figures without any evidence whatsoever. And so we see this coming from the highest levels. Joe Biden has claimed that the figures are not accurate. And the problem with this, of course, is that it is an intentional effort to downplay the violence Israel is doing in Gaza, but it is also no reason to take it seriously that the same organizations reporting casualty figures now have reported the figures in the past, in 2014, for example, during the Israeli assault on Gaza, and these figures are broadly taken as accurate and authoritative. So the only reason to discredit them now is because there is an interest amongst Israel and its supporters to downplay the level of violence being committed by Israel. And moreover, I'll just point out there's been this effort to sort of relabel the figures as coming from the Hamas-run health ministry as a way to discredit them. But indeed, if we're going to say at every instance these figures come from a Hamas-led health ministry, we should also be saying that the figures coming from Israel come from the Likud-run, which is Netanyahu's party, Israeli government. In any conflict, in any situation, there are interests that parties have. And so there is no reason to take seriously what Israel says any more than what Hamas says. And indeed, because Israel is the colonial power, it is committing the bulk of the violence, there is even less reason to believe the statements made by the Israeli government or the statements made by the US government to support Israeli claims. Now, there's a really grotesque element to this too. It didn't start after October 7th. It's a long-standing trope, if you like, amongst Israel and its supporters around the world. And that's this idea, they call it Pallywood. It is a pathetic sort of play on words on Hollywood. And the idea is that Palestinians are not actually dying, are not actually being killed by Israelis, but they're faking it. And they are creating fake videos of atrocities, fake videos of themselves being killed, in order to portray Israel in the worst light possible. Now, this is, frankly, in my view, almost too grotesque to even entertain, but it is something that is common, and I want to make you aware of it if you see this. There are many people who will make this claim, and of course, it's ludicrous on its face, but nevertheless. And so you can see here, one of the headlines here, there was a common claim being made that there was a picture going around of a baby who had been killed, a Palestinian baby, and Israelis and their supporters in the United States and elsewhere were saying, no, it's fake, it's actually a doll, it's not a real person. This kind of thing. Very common, unfortunately. And then you have this claim, very common as well, this is just a war, it's not genocide, and war is always terrible, so you can't call this a genocide because it's just war. Now, I don't think this argument really does the work that the people who put it forward think it does. Even if this were just quote unquote just war, again, we can look at the visual evidence. We know how many people are being killed, what the destruction is like. And it's an argument in favor of stopping the destruction, not an argument in favor of allowing Israel to continue doing what it's doing. But again, indeed, this is not quote unquote just war, but it is a genocide. There is no precedent for the number of children being killed, for the scale of destruction of civilian infrastructure, which is very specifically a war crime to intentionally target hospitals and schools and water facilities and electric facilities and so forth. All of that has been bombed either intentionally or indiscriminately by Israel. Very clear war crimes, very clearly a major element in the ongoing genocide. Despite the denials, genocide is happening, and it is critically important to end it. And so we need immediately a ceasefire, an end to the Israeli hostilities. We need a massive international aid effort to get the food and medicine to the people who need it, and to rebuild, reconstruct all of the damaged infrastructure and homes and so forth. We need, desperately, prosecution of Israeli war criminals, American war criminals, and Palestinian war criminals. Anyone who has committed crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, targeted civilians, etc. We need a unilateral, immediate Israeli end to the occupation. Israel is obligated, it is obliged, it must end its occupation. It can't forever occupy these territories. We need massive Israeli reparations to the Palestinians for the genocide and for all of the other crimes committed against them over the course of more than a century. And we need a right of Palestinian return, upholding this very basic right that people have a right to return to their homes when they are displaced, when they are forced out by a foreign military, etc. So as we come to the end for now of this, I want to talk briefly about where we are and where we go. As you've now seen in the history of this part of the world, there has been an intentional project by one group of people to take control of a territory for their exclusive use. Israel controls its own territory that it claims as the state, but it also controls the West Bank directly, and it effectively controls Gaza. Gaza is still occupied by Israel because Israel controls all of its borders, its airspace, the electricity that gets in, the food, and so forth. And so, because of this, as Lustig but many others have argued, there is already a one-state reality in this territory, from the river to the Mediterranean Sea. There is one regime that governs everything, that everyone who lives there is governed by Israel. And it is an undemocratic regime. That in Israel proper, there is a government that is ostensibly democratic. It allows people to vote. It has certain laws that are meant to guarantee equality of its citizens, but it has other laws that fundamentally prevent all of its citizens from being equal, that make Palestinian citizens of Israel in a lower status than Jewish citizens of Israel. But that same Israeli government also governs the West Bank and Gaza, and there, most of the territory in the West Bank is governed by Israel and its military. There are hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers there. And then in the small part of the territory that is ostensibly under Palestinian control, as per the Oslo unfinished process, they are still collaborating with, under the control of Israel. And there, the military role is severe and violent and deadly for Palestinians. I haven't mentioned it, but since October 7th, more than 500 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank as well, and every year hundreds of Palestinians are killed in the West Bank. So the occupation continues to be incredibly violent there as well. And so those people, both as second-class citizens in Israel and then as subjugated people in the occupied territories, are oppressed because they belong to the wrong ethnic group. They are Palestinian, they are Arab, they are primarily Muslim and Christians, and they are not Jewish. And it is for that reason, and that reason alone, they are denied democratic rights, and they are subjugated and abused and tortured and killed by the Israeli government. This is, as all of the major human rights organizations around the world and in Israel itself have now finally belatedly made clear, ethno-religious apartheid. The Israeli state is set up for the benefit exclusively of its Jewish citizens and for Jews around the world, and it intentionally denies full equality, full rights to anyone else. This is apartheid. B'Tselem, which is the major Israeli human rights organization, has now said so. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, many Palestinian human rights organizations, and on and on. So there is already one state in this territory. So then, where do we go from here? And of course, where we go from here is entirely up to the people who are affected, the people who are subjugated. It is up to Palestinians themselves to articulate what is the future, what does freedom look like. Over the course of more than a century, some have argued, both Palestinians but also Zionist settlers and Israelis, that indeed the solution would be one democratic state, from the river to the sea. Now, various models of this have been proposed. This is not a new idea, and it is not indeed a radical idea. The idea would be something akin to Switzerland with various cantons. So imagine a federal state where you have a Palestinian sub-state within a larger country, and then you have a Jewish state within a larger country, something like this. There are various versions that have been proposed under one federal government, called whatever you call it. Now, the two-state solution, so-called, from the Oslo process is dead. In reality, there is no possible way it could even be put forward and enacted, given the mass settlement in the West Bank in particular, and the resistance of Israel, the refusal of Israel to actually allow a Palestinian state to exist alongside Israel. And so it seems to me that the solution in the near term is a one-state solution. It is democracy for all of the people who live in this territory. And again, this is not a radical argument. Democracy is a very basic idea that we all in the modern world claim to believe in, that people should have equal rights regardless of what their background is. And that seems a minimum standard to me. So one democratic state from the river to the sea. As I mentioned before, my own work is rooted in the pacifist tradition, and it's also rooted in the anarchist tradition. And so in the future, what I think personally justice demands is no borders whatsoever, is democracy for everyone everywhere. But realistically, what this might look like is one democratic state from the river to the sea.